Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Tuesday train with 2MK team. Today, as always, we are playing Guilty Gear Xrd Rev 2 on PlayStation. This is an East Coast. Loser stays on lobby for learning matchups and getting into the game if you're a beginner. So, stop on in if you want to learn some Guilty Gear. And just watch if you want to watch some. This room does have a passcode and an ID, as obviously. Those can be found either in our tweet from the Twitter account 2_MK_FGC or in the stream title. This week we are looking at a beginner concept that is not as obvious in most fighting games as it is in Guilty Gear. I had a cool acronym, but I don't think I'm going to stick with it. It is for helping you get through low levels of most games where spamming is a thing, as it is often called, and to understand the mindset of both a spammer and why you should quote-unquote be a spammer too. Maybe not in online play or super fun matches, but when you're trying to learn the game, you need to remember this fact. Assume that anything you manage to do is godlike until someone teaches you that it's stupid. Some things you learn that is stupid really fast. And if you really get attached to wanting to do it, you should probably go into training mode with it. That's why they make so much training modes these days. But if you find something that's working, and working decently well, ask your opponent to prove to you why it doesn't work. And if the only way you can ask them to do this is by repeating it until they stop it, sometimes that's what you gotta do. This is particularly useful for safer style of move or play because it lets you break down the match into just one or two things to actually do, and observing all of the interactions that those one or two things lead to. If you find yourself being constantly put in a position where the thing you want to do doesn't work well, or even looks or feels wrong, you probably shouldn't be doing that thing. In our Street Fighter Lounge yesterday, we were discussing the fact that no move is really useful without a second move that is done in approximately the same situation to cover your opponent's other potential interruptions. Not necessarily their reactions, because if they're waiting to react, you just do probably the safest thing that's likely to open them up. But we're talking about stuff like people hitting buttons to meet you on your way in. To deal with that, you need to have a little more patience. Not necessarily in terms of holding back from hitting buttons, but in terms of being patient with yourself in your decisions of your options. When you find yourself making the wrong decision fairly often, getting frustrated at it is actually more likely to cause it to happen, because human brains are weird. The team is actually fairly far into our understanding of each other's matchups. And mainly the way that we stay at the beginner level is training something else. Specifically, training to do it without writing it down and without practicing it that much outside of this lounge. The test, therefore, every week is to come back in to face the same 4 to 5 opponents, but to also, from scratch, remember the entire matchup. This is not just the character matchup, but can also be the opponent matchup. Therefore, this week, I will probably be spending less time talking about approaches to matchups unless we get a newcomer who wishes to learn a lot of matchups of their own. That said, spotter work is still going to be an important part of this particular matchup. No longer spotting to check for matchup situations, but rather to assume that everyone understands the matchup and see where their execution or autopilot is failing, so that they know what to work on and what situations to try to avoid if they want to win. One could choose to try to win more by avoiding the situation that your execution is poor in, or you could use the same lounge to practice your execution in that difficult situation, therefore losing and continuing to play. It's perfectly okay with us if you effectively throw your matches by trying something that is hard for you. In the end, you can win in terms of how much you learn through this method. Matchups with non-linear characters are always the hardest to remember, because their moves don't parallel to anything you necessarily understand from just watching your own character. Therefore, remembering every aspect of the matchup is harder simply because you spend more time trying to remember what all their stuff does. This is why it's often useful to understand your neutral and long range mix-ups and style first, so that you don't end up not even knowing how to get in or feeling as if your opponent is going to get to come to you. It is important to learn how to make your opponent not want to approach, to give yourself extra time to think about how to open them up, or to just remember things about the matchup. If your opponent is unwilling to just approach you because they know your defense is on point in some way, you are going to have more options to think about that button that they were using just a moment ago when you were close up. It will buy you enough time to rack your brain for exactly what it was and what you needed to respond with. Similarly, one can learn to respond to moves from far away based on the expectation that they're coming. In Guilty Gear, this often leads to a better use of meter as well. Learning matchups in this sort of game is similar to knowing how to get through anything or fight a boss in nearly any other. Some people have to write it down, some people just do it really often, and some people are so unconcerned about the amount of times you actually have to do it before you get it right. Basically, the sort of person that fights a boss for 3 hours without actually specifically trying to beat the boss. Fighting games don't do a very good job of making us feel comfortable with that innately. We play these games mostly to put up a fight. We often don't think of opponents in these games as bosses in other games, where we could just grind for 3 hours and no one's there to judge you for not managing to win. In this way, SNK games in the old days used to manage to teach us a little bit better, because the end bosses of SNK games are spamming bastards. It's not always just that their moves are safe, it's also partially because they are really willing to just do the same thing over and over again. Similarly, SNK bosses could in fact become nearly impossible to beat by being stubborn and not getting yourself into the right spacing on the screen to deal with the thing, because there is no such thing as a universally bad move in recent fighting games. No matter how slow the startup, Unless the move is unsafe, does terrible damage, and has terrible startup, which again, you don't really find in current gen fighting games. There is always a spacing or a timing at which it's the correct thing to do. Maybe not in every matchup, but there's certainly spacings and timings for them. One example is getting close to push out characters being an instinct that we almost immediately try to do under the mistaken hope that eventually the opponent is going to slip up and not get it right. Many rush down players are much more focused on taking actions immediately than they are on watching the opponent or thinking about the defense that they're going up against. This prevents them from looking for patterns in their opponent's defense. Characters with particularly long-reaching specials often run into the same problem. They get to a certain range and do a move simply because it prevents their opponent from taking any action most of the time. This not only fails in certain matchups after a while, it often leads to you being heavily baited in moves where in games where invincible moves or other really good options of that type, which are normally bad options, become available. Similarly, there are defensive options that are based entirely on the idea that your opponent feels safe after the block string. So let's look at it from the Sin and Kai matchup in terms of that. It's easy to feel that with Sin you should do specials, but he doesn't need to do specials to beat Kai. They're very, very unnecessary to the overall flow, and Kai will tend to defeat them more easily than he will defeat simply Stand Heavy. The problem is that Stand Heavy tends to whiff in front of Kai and make you feel ineffective. Feeling as if you have missed your move and therefore not done well, as opposed to at least making your opponent block with a different move, can be discouraging. But it works because the other half of the mix-up is that Sin has good approaches and Beak Driver to cover that space. When Kai decides to wait for Sin to hit that button, Sin then gets his stuff. Beak Driver in turn pushes them out to the point where Sin can just hit the heavy again. Kai has nearly no counter to this function. It's just Beak Driver into Stand Heavy, and unless you delay it, you probably have no answer. Kai must stand far enough away to not be hit by the Stand Heavy, and you can play the entire game like that until you understand more about it. And then you will get hit by fireballs. But feeling as if you aren't playing the game correctly, or that your opponent isn't putting in enough effort, or doesn't seem to have to put in enough effort to avoid you, are easy ways to fall into the trap of reacting too early and making yourself predictable on offense, which is just going to get you killed against most of the players these days. Axel is Here's another good example of the situation for Sid. While the buttons that he has to use for the job are different, the concept is still the same. There's a range at which Axel is disadvantaged against Sin, and Sin can win mainly by either vaulting into aerial approaches that Axel could respond to but doesn't often manage to, without standing, and inching forward and doing his outcome slide. Eventually, in turn, Axel finds himself needing to attack because there's no good space to stand at that Sin can't cover unless Axel gets closer. At high levels of play, these interact differently because of the amount of anti-airs possible. But overall, Sin can win mostly by doing outcunt and responding to certain things by vaulting. Because despite Axel's ability to deal with it, actually managing to catch Sin's vaults is rather hard, and he does have some control over them, so he can force Axel to whiff. Once Sin is in, Axel is at a relatively heavy disadvantage as long as Sin is the one in the block string. Axel's moves are generally not fast enough to poke his way out of Sin's pressure, despite Sin's pressure generally being sort of slow. Axel in turn needs to constantly come slightly closer and poke at Sin's feet, which opens him up to beat Driver. And doesn't do that well against the vault either. Sin has even better air options than most other characters against Axel. But until your opponent proves to you that you need to use those, why bother? Guard your feet and try to move over Axel's head or toward him with outcut. And that's it. You will take some damage when he clips you or catches you unawares, but the damage you take is not usually more than the damage Axel will take. Understanding this can keep you alive for much longer in this matchup than most options you use. Because a lot of the things Axel does to keep Sin out, while they are really strong, are not necessarily all that good on hit even. And most of them don't convert that well without Axel having meter, which is a hard thing to build when being kept in that space. Ino, on the other hand, has a much easier answer to this poke. Simply dashing forward will take her over at most of Axel's attacks and allow her to whiff punish by just hitting a button to attack forward. This part of the matchup actually ends up feeling really easy for Ino. and harder for Axel, which is why he spends more time in this matchup actually in the air jumping backward, because his diagonal downward air attack covers so much more of Ino's attack vectors than his ground game. And since Ino doesn't have many good moves that reach as far as Axel can when he jumps back, feeling as if you should rush forward at him is a quick way to lose once he starts doing this. This is the quintessential feeling of needing to rush down a character who is defending really well against that rushdown. But emotionally, it's easy for us to get caught up in the times we are successful and basically go, yes, it's working, I can do this. There are, of course, certain matchups in Guilty Gear, and this is absolutely one of them, where if you don't use your Roman cancels correctly, you simply can't get advantage. If you win, it's probably luck. Because you have to understand how to buy yourself time using your Roman cancel to see your opponent's situation. Fortunately, unlike most characters, Ino does not need to use her Roman cancel after a move for this to be useful. She can do so many of her moves from the air at variable heights and has so many good ways of getting her position changed after the opponent has attacked. She can basically cover any space in front of her with those attacks, directly out of her Roman cancel. So she can use meter to make things reactable. Without it, you need to have some relatively high level reactions in order to keep up with Axel in that matchup before you manage to corner him anyway. And Ino doesn't do a very good job of cornering Axel either unless she finally lands the standing dust. But here we see a perfect example of it. If your opponent continually blocks low after your jab string, then keep hitting standing dust. It was a good idea anyway. You're not going to suffer for hitting it, so just hit it. When your opponent stand locks and teaches you how to deal with it, which is generally easy because she has lots of other options at that range, they are quite fast compared to most other characters. Your opponent is the one at disadvantage. If their spacing is negative for them, keep it that way. This is the key core of mix-ups. Understanding that your opponent cannot deal with both situations. Their only option is to guess right or avoid the situation altogether. In most modern games, you can, at least for some time, avoid the situation altogether or punish your opponent repeatedly, at least in small ways, while they are trying to set the situation up. But you have to get to the mix-up part first. Starting from the ability to push on your opponent's defenses, you can get them to understand what a negative situation is and get to the next level of the match, them learning to avoid getting into that situation. Similarly, once Kai is closer, just hitting standing slash on Sin really breaks most of Kai's actions. But this is not something that most Kai will let you do because he won't stand that close without doing any attack stuff. But of course, it goes beyond just remembering I should use these moves. And that is usually the hard part of fighting games. Realizing that someone can tell you, solve your problem by using more of this, but have no help whatsoever in terms of you learning how to properly use it or when to properly use it. That is up to you. The worst thing you can do to yourself, though, is try it a few times and conclude this isn't working. Because the problem is usually not that it won't work, especially if the person advising you is more experienced. If they are still watching, they can often tell you outright while you're doing it wrong. This is not helpful directly, but at least it's enough to know that there is a timing to use it, and you're not using it at that timing, which is making your life difficult. Most of us, however, live in a world of gaming where telling someone, do this differently, is insufficient. And of course, there will be moments like that where there simply was no way to know. Your opponent went for the hard read on what you were going to hit, and it paid off. Those situations don't necessarily mean that you've been doing it entirely wrong. Your aim should generally be to see if you can find what it is about the thing that they've told you to do that is supposed to help. If you understand the move well, you should be able to say, I can see how this is supposed to go, but it's not working because of something different about my opponent's timing. One of the most important skills in all fighting games, therefore, is actually watching your opponent's position after you have hit them but know you can't combo again. It is not intuitive skill for most people because we are used to games that when someone says combo, they mean just keep mashing the button and something good will happen. But fighting games are way more technical than that, just like real martial arts. If you have hit a button and know that you are advantaged but can't be sure your opponent won't defend, give them a little bit, figure out where they are, where they might want to move to, and attack that space. If you must attack the space they are likely to be in, rather than trying to attack where they are. Because if you attack where they are, chances are they have also thought about this, know the best attack you could use, and probably know the counter better than you do. In this matchup, Sin benefits from what most other characters benefit from against Ino, but it requires the same sort of mental gymnastics. It's easy for Sin to throw Ino, but it's only easy at the moment where Ino has gotten close on her own. Therefore, if your mind is on offense when she's far away and switches immediately to defense when she gets close, it's actually nearly impossible to throw her because you will never be fast enough. One has to switch one's entire mindset to viewing Ino's approaches as opportunities for your own offense. In short, if she didn't hit you, you instantly get the throw. You don't even have to think about it. All you have to do is block long enough that you probably blocked it and immediately go for a throw. In almost all situations, this will be advantageous to Sin because he has enough spacing that the only thing that will beat it from Ino will also counter hit his throw or his heavy slash in a way that she can't capitalize on. A lot of fighting games is based around wondering whether or not it is safe to do things. But if you think of it as minimizing damage instead of getting hit at all, you can save yourself a lot of stress. It's little things like this that change the concept of how the game is played in your mind, and often reveals to you where your true weaknesses are mentally. Are you the sort of person, for example, who reacts too early when they want their offense? Does switching your mindset to defense lock you into defending for longer than you need to? And does switching your mindset to offense cause you to immediately mash buttons instead of waiting for your opponent? These things are far more crippling in fighting games than things like not knowing when your opponent is safe or not, because you can easily know that your opponent is open, but because you were mashing so early, you still fail to punish. This is one of the primary issues holding people back recently in the new Dragon Ball FighterZ, for example. It's too easy to get caught in mix-ups because you responded too early, whereas in most other games where the block stun tends to be longer and the opponent tends to be more minus, plus some stuff about buffers that I won't go into, the difficulty of timing your punish correctly is very different. Understanding how to use your buttons and options to make your opponent hesitate can be equally important here. But you should always build your strategy on some foundation that you are comfortable with, so that when you fall back into it because of stress, at least you're still effective. It does not absolutely need to be that complicated, but it does need to be comfortable. Simple characters have always been strong in fighting games provided their options covered enough space. Mental space, that is. As you can see, adding Blitz to Sin's matchup against Kai helps only when all the other parts are in place. Before that, it's just whiffing something in neutral in front of a character who could poke you out at any time. But once you've forced Kai to do a certain subset of things because of the rest of your game, it becomes difficult for him to consistently get in on you while still avoiding the possibility of Blitz. Understanding your core gameplay approaches to a matchup will sometimes let you rediscover the ones you forget as a result of just not playing the character often or not playing the game often. If you don't remember your first order strategy or first principles, one unfortunate situation you can end up in is when you think you remember the main thing, but you're actually remembering the second thing. For example, we're relatively aware from previous sessions that Kai can use Grinder to keep Axel busy and quiet. But there are some prerequisites, even if it's only one. Well, no, there's one prerequisite to this working well. You can absolutely do it at nearly any time, especially if the Axel player is expecting you to do it and holding back on the things that get through the first order strategy. But if they also forget and just go back to first order stuff themselves, where you are remembering, okay, I need to use Grinder, you die primarily because the Grinder doesn't beat the first order Axel strategy. It's too easy to poke Kai out of the setups that come from it. Furthermore, given Axel's strong ability to deal with Grinder spacing when it's bad by using his own standing dust, you often find yourself trying to remember the correct spacing and simply getting held off by Axel attacks. Because while the Grinder is an extremely useful tool in the matchup, Axel can basically hit 5D for free if you set it up wrong. Half the time he can do it on reaction. And if he's at the space where he cannot, it's probably because the Grinder isn't going to pose any threat to him at all anyway, because he's not under any pressure. So always give yourself some time at least to work out your first strategy and stick to it, and try above all else to remember that for the matchup, win or lose. Going too deep into complex strategy too early will simply give you too many things to remember, and also somewhat make the game feel less fun because you can end up feeling as if there are too many obligations in terms of what you need to do to play correctly. A lot of us like to just play a little wild and have fun, but that sort of thing can usually be done from your base tactic if your opponent is an even match for you. There will be at least some random things that happen. However, given the aim of any given character in the game and what the player probably chose that character for, if you can't beat that character's first order strategy, it's very likely that you'll feel bad against the player, because the player picked that character because they liked that strategy, probably. They are enjoying doing that thing that you're having trouble beating. So if you don't remember the way that you beat that particular thing, you can't really blame your opponent for getting to enjoy their own character. Even if they try to hold back a little for you, it's just relatively silly to want a Ken player, for example, to not do Shoryuken because you keep getting hit by it. If one has a good sense of where your opponent is and how well you can watch them while doing your own moves, it will free you up to deal with more complex strategy things without you having to try to make that space. A good example here is that our Ino player is managing those dives against Kai and ending up safe, not because that move is safe, but because all of their other interactions lead them to this specific spot where Kai has no response, but where Ino will end up being plus. And since this is Kanzuki Dynasty and she also plays Kami, she's fairly familiar with how to set those up and identify them. That one, that last one, was probably the one we've seen so far that was out of position. Understanding that your opponent tends to put themselves in a space where one of your strongest approach tools becomes safe is probably one of the most dangerous things you can learn in a fighting game. My opponent stands here, so this move that is normally a bad idea is now a good idea. This is an extreme advantage in most games because your opponent is not used to dealing with the move, presumably because it's usually a bad idea. Less people are likely to use it. So in this case, you can actually see that Ino gets outright mix-ups because of the spacing between the players. Further feeding into the use of her standing dust because Kai ends up defending all the time. Being able to wait for that position, do her dive, and if it does get blocked, immediately go for standing dust is a strong mix-up against nearly all Kai's options. Kai in turn must learn when Ino has put herself in a bad position by hitting that move too early. And a punish is actually even possible. And there you have the final part of it. When you are directly over Kai's head and he's expecting the situation to go in his favor and have enough meter, Ino is still at advantage. But it's that mental state of tracking when your opponent is under pressure and reacting to things you are doing that lets you decide this is now a good idea. So if we look at this matchup from the concept of first principles, The absolute first thing one wants to do is get back out of Kai's primary range, and once there, determine whether or not Kai approached you. If Kai approached a particular way, you get to make certain movements. If he approached a different way, you have to do other movements. You have a lot of time to do most of these things, but the key is that you must watch Kai when you backdash. It's easy to get caught up in playing the mid-game, but Kai has actual advantage in the mid-game, so you have to backdash. Anything you do that isn't backdashing is usually winning by luck. Similar to Kata 31 in Street Fighter, if you backdash with an intention of what you're going to do before the backdash finishes, there's a good chance that your mind did what we consider a freeze frame. It took stock of where your opponent was at the moment of your backdash and decided what it was going to do based on that position. This is extremely dangerous to you in fighting games. It's extremely dangerous to you in any fighting, really. In real life, it would probably get you killed if you had a life-threatening situation. Pay attention to where your opponent is toward the end of your backdash and make your decisions based on that. This also prevents us from doing too many moves because it's quite easy to just do a move because it was the thing you thought of doing when your opponent reacted to your backdash and therefore you need to block. Similarly, if your opponent is waiting for the exact end of your backdash to do something, they are looking for something they've probably primed themselves for. One of the hardest things in fighting games is being primed to have a reaction and then seeing your opponent twitch and holding back the reaction. You can train this in nearly any game with a relatively random replay system. Give yourself any situation where your opponent is doing the exact same move. Your reaction needs to be relatively fast, but the opponent does it at random-ish times. The twitch becomes a serious problem. But as you can see noted there, Sin just basically gets to do his combos for free once he lands near Axel. Sometimes the cancel becomes a little harder based on the timing, but for the most part, you can't do anything. once Scene's combo finishes, even if it's blocked, he can backdash out of nearly anything Axel reasonably should do. You can still get caught with a fair amount of Axel's hard reads, but assuming that you did land the whole thing, beat driver included, just backdash. Because there's no need to go in, and you probably either won't reach or will get caught somehow. Similarly there, given the speed of Axel's moves, you can probably just backdash after nearly any beat driver and not have to worry too much about the hard read happening. If you're worried heavily about the hard read, then you have a counter for that as well. But it's quite hard to get yourself to not react to being under pressure by taking an action. In fact, many of us suffer from the fact that if we are put under pressure, our mind shifts to look at our own character. If you've ever wanted a way to improve at fighting games without actually needing to play, training yourself to watch the opponent character is probably one of the most useful things you can do. You can train this by finding any match footage with anyone who plays your character, preferably in the same color. It literally doesn't matter whether or not they're good, or much better than you, or just a little bit better than you, or meaningfully worse than you in certain situations, depending on how good you are. Because at some point, they're very likely to get pressured. And then you can train yourself to put yourself in their shoes and watch the opposing character instead anyway. But it is generally our instinct to try to act as soon as possible after the opponent's move has been blocked, because we all know that if you delay the action, you don't get to beat them with your move as easily. Speed does matter. This twitchiness, however, becomes more and more dangerous as you get higher level because of frame traps. Frame traps are when your opponent is advantaged, knows that if you try to attack, they can hit you before you succeed, but can't necessarily keep their attack going. They're advantaged enough, usually after you blocking, that they cannot keep going and be assured of any damage. They'll just eventually push you out. But they know that if you attempt to counterattack them, they can get a bigger attack in. So they count almost entirely on the idea that people are twitchy. People constantly try to move, get their moves ready, punish things. And when eventually they're successful, it's a very positive feeling for most people. When you find yourself stressed out about responses and doing your moves too quickly and so on, it's usually a sign you should probably take a break. Some other people, depending on their level of mental stress, can deal with this by trying to control their breathing and forcing themselves to not attempt to counterattack. But against certain characters in certain games, the mix-ups are simply too heavy for that to lead to much success. One could, however, of course, let go of the feeling that you should win, which would then allow you to do it. If you find that you're not the type of person who can keep yourself quiet, it may be better to stop playing entirely for a while and let your brain calm back down, usually with food. Kai, for example, suffers relatively in this matchup because almost all of Axel's follow-ups to his crouch heavy target Kai's weak points. And the one move that works really well, assuming that Kai is at the correct spacing, is also the move that is least safe and generally not the one you feel is the best one to use. Given the options, Kai should be able to just greed sever after many of Axel's cancels. But for this to work, Kai has to expect it, and Kai has to recognize that he is at the right spacing for the edge of the greed sever to hit. If he's at the wrong spacing, then greed sever actually loses to most of Axel's options. Understanding that your spacing heavily changes the effectiveness of moves in fighting games is a little counterintuitive when you're just starting out. Most of us who have grown up with games as a generality, and even those of us who are getting used to them now in various media, usually mobile, are used to playing games where there is no spacing to think of. There is no variability in whether or not you doing this action is going to work. It is either you did it fast enough or in the correct timing in some other way, or you did not. With the decline in both platformers and high-speed movement corridor shooter style games, neither of which even would come up on mobile that much in the first place, we do have a lot of players who are trying to come into fighting games and expect the understanding of strategy coming from things where anticipation is a much more effective method of doing things. Even in things like MOBAs, a lot of the game is pointing your cursor or your attack at a certain spot with the expectation that your opponent will cross into that space, and then just hitting the button to unleash the attack. Even though fighting games seem to have a much more constricted field of play, this is not generally the reason why they're simplistic. A reason why they're simplistic. One of the other difficult problems in these games is that if you do immediately try to move whenever your opponent has finished attacking, it is often difficult to get a good idea of the spacing in the first place. You should at least somewhat learn to consider it useful to dodge attacks or to understand that you don't need to respond to attacks because your opponent is too far away for the attack to matter. The awareness that your opponent's attack is likely to miss or be blocked in a way that pushes you back too far for them to be successful is key to a lot of fundamental fighting game play. The entire concept of the whiff punish is moving to a space where you know your opponent's attack will be launched but will not hit you. Therefore, you do not even have to enter the defensive stance and can immediately prepare to counter their move. In some cases, a true whiff punish involves the player being so sure that it will happen that they even hit the whiff punish button early. Similarly, you can take advantage of this from your opponent's side, knowing that you are standing too far away for any of your opponent's moves to hit, but that they are twitchy and will still do a move. This often helps you learn to dodge moves in fighting games as well. low profiling other moves that you expect, simply because you realize you're at the space where your opponent wants to hit it, and if you do this other thing, then they won't hit you. It's much easier when you're learning these games to take note of the positions you end up in, rather than trying to force them. It takes a relatively higher level of comfort with your character and experience to be able to set up or force the spacings and situations you desire. On the other hand, doing the correct things is a lot more about watching for the correct moments to do things, the anticipation mentioned earlier. And sometimes the correct thing to do is nothing at all, but unless you're watching, you won't be able to recognize those moments either. There's a decent chance that when a higher level player is beating you in a way that feels as if they're dismantling you, it's because they're simply not bothering to defend against certain things. Watching this also gives you a clearer idea of what a given opponent considers important, both in terms of timing and in terms of how they use their meter. And therefore what will be on their mind when you manage to deprive them of either meter or a favorable timing. One good example shown there is actually that what Ino's response after either blocking or getting hit by Axel's crouching heavy, what that response is heavily related to where Ino is on the screen rather than anything else. If you don't learn to recognize the space you're in after blocking it, you won't necessarily know what to hit. In some cases, she can recover forward and start hitting attacks immediately. In other cases, she has to get into the air and do one of her attacks from there. In another case, she's actually better off trying to recover backward and waiting for him to whiff another attack. Being consistently subjected to that position, therefore, makes it possible for you to see more of the game rather than forcing yourself to attempt to react as quickly as possible to get your next little bit of damage. And as mentioned prior, Ino's aim in this match, as well as Kai, is to recognize when she is at the right timing and spacing to do her dive and it be safe or plus, and when she's not. A lot of the game's pressure and flow relies almost entirely on whether or not Ino is safe after that attack. Similarly, you could spend more time in a round working out how to make sure you were at that spacing. If you found that your opponent had difficulties dealing with it, or if you just really wanted to get in. Understanding which of your own block strings leave you at that space, for example. And what your other options are when you need to attack but aren't at that spacing. You often have at least some. Similarly, making your opponent feel as if you're in the wrong space and then forcing a reaction that is still disadvantageous to them is part of the mind games. The third layer is often putting them at that space, having them realize this is a bad situation, and then not even going for the move that they expect you to do, much like that. Obviously, the more of these factors you can combine, the more effective you will be at any given move you want to spend time doing. The air game in this game is actually very heavily based around that because of number of different aerial vectors that some characters have for attacking. The more aerial characters in this game have such extreme variability in their air game that being able to recognize them to see how to respond is heavily skewed in the favor of the attacker. You have to build up a lot of understanding of very minute aerial situations to get through most matchups safely, whether you be playing Venom or Potemkin. I think the only character who you don't really care and don't have to pay attention is Faust, because Faust is either hitting you or not hitting you. And he probably even still has some good aerial setups, just not as many that you would be ambiguous about. So as with all games, your general aim is to remember two different things that are advantageous to you, and one use of meter. If you are at a casual station, at a tournament, write it down for yourself really quickly, especially if you get to fight the same opponent again. Because there's nothing worse than wasting your time not being able to play the match because you have already managed to forget in the stress how you were supposed to play it. This just leads to people beating themselves up later. For example, given Ino's range, she's difficult to punish with Sin's supers. But she's extremely vulnerable to Blitz, because she basically can't get any offense. And against her, Blitz generally keeps you safe long enough that you don't have to worry about too much else. Even if she doesn't get hit by it, or doesn't really spend a lot of time getting through it, or is not able to spend a lot of time getting through it, you have gotten an advantage. But even if she doesn't, you don't care. Because it also creates the space that Sin needs to keep control of this matchup. Furthermore, Ino spends so much time at ranges where Sin can just do it and not have to worry about anything she does, that she just loses, generally. She has responses, but none of them are so good that Sin's response needs to be, I need to stop using Blitz. At worst, he would have to hold back on how often he uses it. But the situation it creates for him is advantageous enough that he'd probably want to keep it up. Ino in turn therefore plays like this, trying to deny Sin meter for as long as possible so that the Blitz is not an issue. But he has options to deal with this too. They're just harder to execute. unfortunately, that trick from Ino is still more effective. If you're in a situation where you can't write down or in other ways access notes, tell your spotter outright to remind you, maybe between rounds or whatever. As you can see there, for example, Sin actually can dash out of a ton of Axel stuff at certain ranges. Particularly the ranges that Sin tends to want to stand at versus Axel. Axel, however, is the better zoner and gets to cover almost all of the space regardless of anything else. The things that Sin cannot dash out of are things that don't do that much damage. Unfortunately, the standard thing that happens to people in fighting games is that they are never able to get to the next level of something until they've mastered the first. This is so often true that if you find yourself hitting a plateau in a game, there's a high chance that the reason for your plateau is that you tried to push on a particular situation too hard. If your expectation is that you must learn to counter this thing in this particular way, or you'll eventually lose, this won't help you because you won't get to eventually. So, always be kind to yourself and try to deal with the situation in front of you in the optimal way first. And, again, assume it is godlike until you're taught that it is stupid. And usually you have to be consistently taught that it's stupid. So if Sin's best response to Kai is to backdash, basically always backdash. You'll find that most of the time you're taking damage from not backdashing, so since your game is not improving by not doing it, you might as well do it. It's also often easy to get into the feeling that your game has improved because of something your opponent does or fails to do. But the better opponent that you're afraid of will simply realize, oh, you don't backdash. Okay, I win now. Because they will have the same reaction. They will do something until you prove to them it's a bad idea. And if that something is something that beats Sin that don't backdash, then you will lose because you never learned to backdash. Similarly, if Kai decides, I'm going to try to open Sin up without throwing, well, you could eventually get somewhere, but high-level Sin will probably dismantle you because it's a large enough part of this matchup that Kai has to care. I suppose he could also try to play the fireball game the entire time, but Sin has some responses to that at least. And Sin gets much more damage off the hard read, so even if you don't manage to lose, technically you could lose just by getting hit with large moves. For example, look at the damage difference in Kai when Sin is at a particular space. The same moves are hitting, but Kai's setups from them and his damage when they connect are so much lower. Note also that his risk meter is pretty much gigantic at this point. One good hit from Sin will basically break down Kai's health. There is probably no character in this game who spends more time watching parts of the screen other than herself as Jacko. She spends a lot of time in the air and therefore makes it more difficult sometimes to watch the opponent, but as an overall thing, she spends a massive amount of time trying to at least keep track of their general position. She's a very spacing-heavy character on top of all that and doesn't have a particularly good backdash. So she doesn't get a lot of extra options in most situations. Therefore, keeping careful exact track of the opponent's position to know when to defend and when to go for Elysian Driver is a heavy core of Jacko's game plan. While most of her moves have long hit stun, they also leave her relatively unsafe or set up situations where she has to worry. Whereas the Whiff Punish form of Elysian Driver does not have this problem at all. once she hits with it, she has a decent amount of time to do basically anything she wants. And as a generality, tends to have a better situation than most characters do after their throws. Because of the relative ease of baiting opponents into taking actions after Elysian Driver, you can often just do it twice. There are certain characters against whom immediately doing another one is the answer, because even if they attempted to do anything about it, they would just end up sliding right into the next one. For slower characters with bigger attacks, she can even do this on reaction. Potemkin is relatively susceptible to this attack style from her, as an example. Her other buttons, as demonstrated there, have similar range and are safer at the range where she would want to do it anyway. The driver avoids most lows, and the other attacks deal with nearly everything else anyone does due to her extending her hitbox relatively strongly in front of her. So, it's not that much to remember. As mentioned last week, Slayer's strongest capacity in most of his matchups is that at the end of Slayer's block strings, he is in an advantageous position for himself. He is the opposite of Kai. All Slayer needs to know is, what is my opponent most likely to do at the end of my block string? And then use one of his moves that beats that. Usually with a slight delay to make it even easier, because he could at least block a little bit and then with punish. Similar to Ino, therefore, when he is on defense, even against Axel, understanding what spacing he's at after one of Axel's moves is blocked is how he makes his decisions. The best he can learn, therefore, is to simply watch those positions. Where am I after Axel's attack, and what is Axel most likely to want to do now? Slayer's strength being, he can absolutely find some button to hit in nearly every one of his actions that helps him keep control of the match even if he doesn't do any damage. By making it a bad idea for Axel to take any actions of his own. This turn is doubly advantageous for him, because if he does manage to get Axel to not want to take actions, then he will get in and set up the same situation in which he is advantageous because of the block string. While it would seem that Slayer as a character is relatively easy to keep out because his moves are relatively close range, the fact that he is oppressive in neutral like that and gets to continue attacking, or at least choose whether or not he's going to continue, means that a lot of the high-level Slayer players don't actually find that much trouble being kept out by players of characters other than Venom, I think. It is on the opponent to take the risk of choosing what hard read they're going to attempt to stop Slayer from hitting a button. Add that variable dash of his into this whole mix, and you become unable to keep him out entirely altogether. Kai has some of the better pokes for actually keeping Slayer at bay, but just like anything else, Slayer has a way to beat it, just not with normals. Since Slayer's Dandy Step attacks are both invincible at certain points, and a mix-up, Kai doesn't get a lot of options after Slayer is poked out from his stuff. Slayer does the attack and then blocks. Kai, in turn, must hit a button, and then Slayer gets to immediately use his own attack again. Whereas most characters want to get back in on Kai don't have a relatively guaranteed method, Slayer has 4. Very problematic. And not only does he have 4, technically for most players, 2 of them are unreactable, and the other one has high priority. He has only one relatively poor method, and that is just jumping, which he never really has to use. Kai therefore has to put a lot of effort into every pushback. He can't push Slayer out with a poke and leave him there. Whereas with other characters, he's just safe and can stay on defense. Against Slayer, he has to commit to that whole thing. Activate something after, go for Blitz, buy himself time with Greed Sever, and hope that Slayer does not do anything that would get under it. There's a lot of shifting that needs to happen because Kai does not get to control the space well enough. However, strategically, he still has an option. Because the Slayer player should normally be expecting Kai to stick out the counter poke, Kai has options of anything else that fills that space. Even if they're not normally as good and might lose to Slayer stuff, that's just part of the mix-up. He could do something else. Because he can't just keep on sticking out the same thing and getting with punished or mixed up. Fortunately, the aforementioned spacing comes in. If you really are a master of playing Kai, you will quickly learn the spaces that Slayer leaves himself at, where otherwise risky moves become good ideas. Even Greed Sever can be used in many situations for this. even with the patched version of the game where it's supposedly much easier to punish, Slayer is not really great at punishing it anyway. As almost all of Slayer's hit and hurt bosses put him in situations where he's likely to get hit by the Greed Sever before he does anything else if he tries to intercept it, and likely to just get hit by Kai's Invincible Uppercut if he does it any other way. The other side of this is that most of the time, when Slayer does get damage off Kai trying to take one of those less safe actions, he doesn't get to keep up actual pressure. He gets a knockdown, but Kai is a character who can just get directly out of knockdowns. If you were a character who had to worry about wake-up pressure, then you'd be absolutely terrified of characters like Jam or Slayer getting knockdowns on you. But if you absolutely don't care, and are just willing to do his uppercut, then do his uppercut. Being 100% confident in your spacing against Slayer is not really required to beat him, because Slayer's damage stacks up by the heavy things he manages to land on you in neutral due to you hesitating. Jackal has a similar approach against Kai because of the number of Kai's normals that he must use to deal specifically with houses being super punishable by slight dashes into Elysian Driver. There are a lot of things where Jackal really doesn't have to do anything else, because as soon as Kai has to deal with houses at all, he becomes vulnerable to this move. Protecting the houses is more work the other way. And being able to make Kai hesitate to do those things because he expects to get drivered is just letting houses power up. As you can see, Kai's punishes for Elysian Driver when it riffs don't tend to be that good either. For various reasons, the hurt boxes of that move mean that nearly nothing Kai does a lot of damage, unless he was watching specifically for it. And if your Kai opponent is able to watch specifically for it, while also protecting himself from K-House, then you probably have a really strong opponent. Or, in the better case, someone who is extremely vulnerable to Jackal's Standing Dust. Understanding which is something you have to build up over time, of course, but playing other parts of the game don't generally help you get very far. Understanding when to try to put yourself in that space and force Kai to react, and when to leave him alone long enough that he will start to focus on minions and houses, is the management system involved in playing Jackal in this matchup. Compared to most characters, Jackal is probably the most lacking in ways to deal with the post-attacks of Axel's new crouch heavy. Elysian Driver will allow her to go over, but it will not be enough to actually deal with him, because the range should almost always be wrong. And she's not a character who benefits a lot from going into the air immediately either. However, she is one of the characters who is most powerful without doing anything. Simply jumping straight up solves almost all of her problems in this matchup in that situation. Because Axel is at enough of a disadvantage when too many minions are out that Jackal really doesn't have to do anything at all. In the few situations where she is brought close enough to him that jumping straight up would not be safe, Elysian Driver does become a valid option. As well as that move. So she should just assume that she can just jump straight up, get back some pressure, and have enough time for her minions to get into position and do something. Other spacing options are just as useful, but the key is to understand them all as well as you can. Putting yourself in situations where you are testing new ideas can actually be detrimental to you if you haven't mastered the first idea. One way to look at this would be that if you are finding that the position you are in is bad and you shouldn't hit a particular button, your better option is often to do nothing and see what your opponent really gets from there. Maybe they will continue on to do something that is still bad for them. But even more usefully, you could figure out where they don't get anything at all. Which allows you to feel more confident and slow yourself down so you don't feel as if you must have a response in the first place. Once you've identified the situation enough times, your knowledge of your character should naturally cause you to have a feeling as to what to do. If an opponent consistently is in the wrong space for one move, and you can feel and see that, just observing that space enough times is more likely to be useful to you than trying to do another move, because at that point you'd be spending a lot more time trying to figure out whether or not the move was a good idea or if you were in the right position. This distracts from the amount of time you're able to spend identifying the situation or verifying that it's the same every time. Whereas once you have done that, it's usually fairly intuitive, if you're good at your character, what exactly you're supposed to press. So rather than trying to find an answer to the situation immediately, observe the situation as much as you can and wait for your natural talent with your character to give you the answer. It is one of the most powerful ways to build confidence in your character and your skills in fighting games. Spending more time watching the spaces and waiting for your natural idea of your character to solve your problems, over hitting random things and seeing what happens that way. It is of course possible to hit random things when you are sure of the situation. If your opponent is heavily reliant on one attack type, then you probably have enough time to pick randomly. But give yourself enough time to come up with something first. Because it is through understanding why that's something that does not work that you are often able to figure out what should. Being surprised by one move whiffing often gives you a quick idea of what should replace it. It also gives you a clearer idea of what your opponent wants to do at particular spacings themselves, rather than wondering whether or not they happened to be successful or not based on something you did. With punishing in fighting games is an art based almost entirely on this particular form of watching the opponent. Offense and defense are both relatively linear and don't actually help you understand how to whiff punish things. This is because mix-ups tend to be very close range, and feeling that we have done something incorrectly is an easy way to get us to panic and drop all of our mental processing of the situation, just mash some buttons, hope it works, and try to react to whatever happens afterwards. Unfortunately, this doesn't take us very far because we end up unable to really maximize the potential of our character knowledge and spend a lot more time trying to counter the opponent directly. That, for example, was a matter of understanding that if Kai is left alone long enough, he will probably attempt to destroy the house eventually. And waiting just long enough to hit a button intended to deal with him for doing that. It's more likely to be patience that gets you through there and observation than figuring out which button randomly wins, because the timing of your opponent is also random. So as mentioned before, Kai is paying attention here to when he's in the space where instant air grinder gets him out of other stuff, and when he's in the space where straight up greed several works. This is one of the basic principles of neutral in any fighting game. Seeing how close you can get so that your opponent's move is no longer as advantageous to them when they do it, rather than simply going block or not block. The more you learn about the spacings your opponent's attacks work at, the more stress you can put them under. This also avoids you getting locked into playing pure defense because your mind has gone, okay, the move has hit, I didn't get in, I need to wait longer. Paying enough attention to your situation to understand that you might have another option, and the situations in which you do not have another option, allows you to maximize your chances to test your random buttons. And the more options you have for testing those, the more likely you are obviously to find one that helps. Similarly, even though it is a somewhat dirty psychological trick in some cases, reacting some of the time to your opponent's attacks and not reacting at other times allows the opponent to build up the perception that you will eventually fall for it without understanding necessarily that what they are doing is not causing you to fall for an attack, but rather facing your own calculated risk system for eventually getting some damage off it. And it's at that point where you start playing with these calculated risks that you're able to have the quintessential fighting game experience. Whether that be playing solid defense for 20 seconds, or with punishing nearly every move your opponent does. The matchup between Kai and Slayer leads to one of the most advanced concepts in Guilty Gear: the raw Roman cancelled defense. It was much harder to do, if not impossible, depending on which game you were in, before this game, but it's entirely possible to just hit your Roman cancel at the end of your opponent's block string as soon as you think you have recovered. If this works correctly, the situation you create for yourself is very character dependent, but often very useful. So many of your opponent's attacks rely on them getting the timing to do certain things against you correct. And either their cancels or their shifts that you can actually mess them up. This is particularly useful because you are effectively invincible on certain Roman cancel situations. And this allows you to see where to go. Since so many of the mix-ups of certain characters in this game are more so unreactable than they are unstoppable, you can literally just use your meter to slow down time enough to force your capacity to react. Similarly, if your opponent does not have to make the decision of which direction they're going in the mix-up until the last moment, hitting the RC to slow them down can break their mental flow and their ability to effectively sense what you are trying to do. If nothing else, it helps with the aforementioned ability to see when you should or should not have made an action. Even if you still end up making the action, understanding that you should not have done it because you got to see in that moment, okay, they were not where I thought they were, is useful to you. This helps you gain a greater and greater understanding over time of where your opponent ends up after certain things and what your real options are. If you have absolutely nothing else you can find to use your meter for, simply RC to slow your opponent down enough to see where they are. Chances are if they're too close for this to buy you any time, you had a better option anyway. Jackal can do a similar thing with Blitz because of the range she tends to stand at. Particularly against relatively aggressive characters like Slayer, dashing in and blitzing is a thing that she can just do. When the opponent is relatively confident in their longer buttons on their character, starting from far away with a character like Jackal or Dizzy, and immediately using the meter you got from trying to close in on it means that they're less likely to hit the buttons. The benefit of having such long, high priority buttons on Slayer is actually a disadvantage in the situation where your opponent is blitzing at you, because you are much more likely to feel comfortable just hitting them. This especially helps with Jackal's offense. And as her defense tends to be relatively solid against Slayer in the first place, that's mostly where she needs the help. This key can open up a lot of things that she needs to do in the matchup. And while it is not necessarily the first order strategy, it ties well into them to the point where you might as well just add it. It's not really there to specifically counter a ton of things that it won't be able to counter if you just do it. You will always have something that you can do from the Slayer side. If Jackal is not blitzing, there's always some option. Your best option against Jackal blitzing is to do nothing. While we reset our positioning, another character who has this as a reasonably strong option in this game is Leo. Leo has enough other moves of that type that simply rushing up to an opponent on his knockdowns and blitzing can be kind of problematic for them. Fortunately for most players, Jackal at least runs out of meter faster than Leo does. She is also a character who benefits the most from simply countering Slayer's post-hit pressure with her blitz. Other characters do not benefit from this because if Slayer stands still, they don't get that much. However, Jackal normally manages to completely protect her minions without being in too much danger. The minions often go forward with her, and Slayer is unable to hurt any houses in the meantime. The rest of this can be dealt with in the standard way for this matchup, which is basically just a neutral jump everything. However, hovering in the air with Jackal's attacks does not actually lead to a good situation. She may get a little damage, but most of the time, she will get dismantled because Slayer will either take the damage and then hit her anyway, or manage to block it and be at an extremely advantageous position even after that. However, as noted from the beginning, we all have this strong tendency to just attack because the opponent appears to be open for attacking. Learning to hold this instinct back is probably one of the most important things in learning fundamentals of fighting games. to get rid of that feeling of, it now's my chance, I should act. While this may sound like I'm saying you should not move much, it's rather that in a scramble situation, you should be more sure of yourself before you go for a counterattack. Obviously, the opponent also manages to bait you relatively heavily in those situations. To prevent it, one should often try to learn to not be in a defensive stance at all, because returning to neutral often means that you can actually return to a fully neutral stance of your own. As long as you're not within your opponent's poke range, why do anything? Jackal in particular benefits from this more than other characters. If she takes too many actions, the opponent too easily sees through her approaches. If she stays calmer in neutral, the opponent is more so on edge. They might manage to get away with more hits and cause her more problems, but in terms of increasing her skill, or your skill with the character, just doing very little of anything for a certain period can be more useful to you. Without this, it's difficult to feel the rhythm of your opponent and know when they're going to want to make their attacks. And because you are so likely to end up watching yourself, a thing that happens primarily because when we are on defense, we want to make sure that our opponent did not break our defense, which ironically results in us not necessarily watching the opponent as much. Most of us are actually more capable of putting up proper defense in neutral by being as relaxed as possible. It also increases the speed at which we can mount proper offense by making it clearer what position the opponent is in and how likely they are to be able to react to something we do. Finally, it obviously increases your capacity to feel comfortable in scrambles, and make you less likely to feel the need to throw out buttons. While her Blitz is not as useful in this matchup as it is against Slayer, it can still definitely help her a lot as a method of omnidirectionally guarding her houses against an approaching opponent. So how does one learn to react correctly in these situations while still relaxing? Mostly, the answer is practice. For some of us, a lot of emotional control is required. That calm actually increases your reaction time and allows you to overwhelm opponents who are themselves scrambling too much. The relaxed state allows you to keep more of your options in mind at the same time, and that in turn makes you more capable of executing them when needed. For most of us, they just flow naturally out, just like our combos. But the higher your tension is, and I don't mean the bar at the bottom of the screen, the less likely you are to be able to recognize a situation and not already have started to do something that would not have been a good idea. Because that's generally your worst problem in these sorts of games when you don't have the calm. You could easily recognize what you probably should have hit, but by that time you've already twitched and hit something else. And your option for doing it is gone. Of course, for certain characters, these two being a good example, sometimes just hitting buttons beforehand is a good idea. But this is usually because you understand how much of the screen those buttons cover, and you don't really need to open your opponent up as much. It's natural to be able to relax somewhat when playing Slayer and Axel, especially in the matchup itself. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they spend the same amount of time waiting to see the actions of the other. which means that this match becomes mostly a matter of how well they understand the usage of their meter. Since the only way to get strong advantage is to use Roman cancels to correct when you have done a button that you shouldn't have done. Fortunately, neither character has a whole lot of use for their meter other than that, so they're usually fun. Since neither one benefits that much from using the Blitz in the matchup, at least at this level, Roman cancelling your bad ideas, or sometimes your good ideas, or just hitting it at times where you're not sure which one it was, is a good way to complement the rest of the game plan. Since so much of it is poking, getting into the correct position, and not making any mistakes, being able to just spend meter to minimize the effect of your mistakes increases your chances of victory and of learning things. Since Axel does not trade favorably with most of Kai's forward-moving attacks, he has to spend a lot more time throwing out buttons. And most of the time the Roman cancel will not save him in this matchup, if Kai has already started the move. However, Kai does have a lot of ways under his higher ones, so Axel relies a lot on his crouching moves in this matchup. Hence the benefit of the latest patch. Just being able to crouch heavy as a general thing, and set up from there, helps the situation a lot. It's also a good way to learn to use your Roman cancel as less of a panic situation button, which tends to make us mash it. And both to use it more often, so that even if you did mash it, you didn't have enough meter for it to matter. And to preemptively throw out buttons because you need to, but aren't sure that they would be a good idea in the first place. Once you do this, it's easier to decide whether or not you should be continuing. Slayer, for example, suffers relatively heavily if he can't block in time to get through Axel's defense, and therefore can't afford to commit to too much. But as you just see there, once the Roman cancel is added, the feeling of safety in those situations changes. Axel absolutely can keep Slayer out, but once Slayer gets in, it's really hard to get him back out again without using certain invincible things or taking at least one risk. Therefore, Axel counts a lot on those moments where Slayer has mistimed or misspaced something, and Slayer in turn can negate that by just cancelling and moving forward. Adding this layer also makes Axel less willing or likely to immediately try for a very fast punish or reaction to things that Slayer does. It also resets the punish situations so that even when Slayer does get hit, it's not necessarily the same feeling. And the interaction between the characters goes back to where Slayer is comfortable, him effectively getting poked in neutral, more so than him getting punished for doing a move. So even if he did get hit, he's still in the optimal Slayer position. Got poked a little bit, could do a big move and stop the opponent. You see therefore there the aforementioned response that Kai has of expecting Slayer to block because he's occasionally doing the poke to keep him out, and sometimes breaking that expectation and going for a much slower move that Slayer ends up blocking anyway. It is because of the perception that this style of play is actually playing in neutral that Slayer can be said to be a neutral-heavy character. Because when he faces other characters who are strong in neutral, this sort of playing out is relatively common. Kai, as you see here, uses his meter to get in because there's really not much else to use it for. Confirming your situation and being the one in control of the space between you and Slayer is a much higher advantage than basically anything else the meter could do for Kai in this matchup. Given that the startup of the Blitz means there are only two positions in which this is a good idea to do against Slayer, and they don't come up very often.
昔の君は理想論者だった。王たる重責をし
And as is standard for us, this is probably the last match. And we are probably getting off the train at the next station. A little early today, but the timing just synced up that way, I think. Join us tomorrow for open mic content for Street Fighter V, and on Thursday for Kame House beginner lobbies in Dragon Ball FighterZ. Friday, most likely some bot content, or a look at Kata 33. And for our unfortunate newcomer who has joined just as we're closing, sorry, but of course we will be around next week at the exact same time, well, which started 3 hours ago. And hopefully you can get your practice done. But we are here every week at this time, and the parameters don't change. So hopefully you will be able to make it next week. But for now, this is Virillion for Team 2MK. Good night, everyone.